Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you the libertarian perspective on the burning issues of the day. I'm joined as I am every week by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, who teaches economics at the Citadel. Richard, welcome back for another week.
It's good to be here with you and our viewers and listeners.
Yeah, well, you know, a couple of weeks ago we talked about immigration socialism and all of the chaos that comes with central planning and immigration. And lo and behold, we now end up with the ultimate in immigration dictatorship, which is now all over the news. And that's, of course, the decree law, which is what I call it, by Donald Trump, that has just thrown the immigration problem into total chaos and disorder. Not surprisingly, I mean, you and I have argued for years and years that immigration central planning is like any other form of immigration socialism. It produces chaos. Ludwig von Mises called it planned chaos. And that's why we've had an immigration crisis that's been going on for decades. That's what immigration central planning does. But here Trump, Richard, has carried it to its ultimate level. I mean, when you had the dictatorship of General Augusto Pinochet, which I've studied extensively, he issued what were called decree laws. And what it was that there was no legislature. He'd abolished it. And so he would just issue a decree. And that decree was automatically considered law that the Chilean bureaucrats and the army and so forth were required to enforce. And that's why they were called decree laws. Well, that's the very nature of a dictatorship. A dictator dictates. He issues dictates and orders and commands. He doesn't need to worry about a legislature. He doesn't need to worry about going through the lawmaking process. He just issues his decree. And what's really fascinating about this is that Trump is already doing this in the first week of his tenure. I mean, you and I argued long before his election that he had dictatorial tendencies. But here is the ultimate manifestation of this, where he just issues a decree, doesn't go through Congress, doesn't ask Congress to say, hey, I've got an immigration reform package. I want to exclude immigrants from these countries where the U.S. has been bombing and killing people and where people might want to retaliate. No, he didn't want to bother with the deliberative process. He just issues a decree law that says, here is my order, that these people from these 7 countries will no longer be permitted to come into the United States. If they're on their way to the United States, tough luck. They're going to be refused. Even if they have green cards, they're going to be refused. Oh, but a day later, a new decree law is issued, amending the previous decree law, saying, well, maybe green card people are okay. I mean, it's all arbitrary. It is the rule of the dictator. And not surprisingly, Richard, it has produced massive chaos, massive disorder, and massive suffering. I mean, here we are at the ultimate in the immigration socialist central planning, the dictatorial decrees of a man who knows better than anyone else.
Well, I think that we should also put this in a context. Classical liberals and libertarians, in my estimation, obviously yours, think that these types of decisions and actions by a president are beyond the pale, inappropriate, violations of a more traditional and at least the spirit of a constitutional order. But who have been the major critics of this in the last few days? And that would be people on the left and members of the Democratic Party. They're up in arms. You see, this is the worst of Donald Trump. But where did Donald Trump get the precedent for doing this? Now, executive orders have been signed and instituted by a large number of presidents over American history, particularly in the post-World War II period, as there has been increasingly that sense of a concentrated and centralized imperial presidency. But the headline notoriety of it, the arrogant presumption of it, was begun by Donald Trump's predecessor, Barack Obama. He's the one who said, I have a phone and I have a pen. And that's all I need. If Congress will not pass my legislation, if there are special interest groups in society that do not appreciate and want to go along with my vision of what America needs for national health care or for allowing these changes in various social and domestic and foreign policies, then I will just decree them by executive order. That is precisely what Donald Trump is doing. Now, the very people who liked it when Barack Obama would do these things in, quote, defiance against the resistance of the Republicans in Congress, now are shocked that a president should declare usurpation of such constitutional authority and step on the basic and decent rights of an individual human being. He is merely continuing the tradition of the breakdown of the traditional notion of limited government with divided powers to balance each other under constitutional rules as a method to restrain encroachment of government and in an attempt to secure the liberty of the citizenry. He is merely following in that tradition. Now, this also follows from something, and this is, again, the progressive view. They have been saying, but the Constitution was written by these old fogies of over 200 years ago. What can they say about the needs and necessities of our society today? The Constitution has to be a living document representing the spirit and the sense and the zeitgeist of the time. And the president personifies the will of the people. He's elected by the people. And therefore, the Constitution must be flexible, and the president should have authority to do these executive orders to express the needs of the moment and not the frozen, stodgy ideas of dead white men of the past. Well, that's what Barack Obama did, as well as, admittedly, presidents before him. But now Donald Trump picks up the same pen, and suddenly what do these progressives and lefties and Democrats say? This is violating the Constitution. You set the rules of the game. You are now realizing that you sow what you reap, that, to use all these metaphors, the sword has two edges. And the problem is that if Donald Trump were to either be impeached or in 4 years were to be removed and replaced by a Democrat who was elected, and if that Democrat proceeded to do things with their executive order pen, suddenly these people who were shocked and protesting would say, well, you know, some things have to be done for the good of the people. This is the hypocrisies, the inconsistencies, the lack of principles that pervade our system. And I don't want to seem, to use a phrase of Fox News, that I seem unfair and unbalanced. Notice what the Republicans are doing with this. You have Ryan, the Speaker of the House. Oh, it's okay to do this. It's necessary. And then, admittedly, you have a few voices who have spoken out against this. But what is the greatest sound that has arisen from the bulk of the Republicans and declared constitutional conservatives in the Congress? The deadening sound of silence. This is what we have, a bankrupt political system, because we've lost the anchor of the ideal of the principles of liberty, individual rights to life, liberty, and honestly acquired property. And the implications of which is the free exchange of goods and services, plus all other forms of peaceful and voluntary association, and freedom to move. That as long as a person clearly cannot be directly found to be about to eminently perform or evidence to show that he has been implicated in a violent act, he should be free to live and move about as he chooses in any society. That is the ideal of a regime of liberty.
Yeah, you brought up some very important fundamental issues. I mean, first of all, with respect to a democratic, constitutionally limited government republic. I mean, our system was founded in such a way that there would be three branches of government. You had the legislative branch, whose responsibility would be to enact the laws. Then it would be the executive branch that would enforce the law, and it would be the judicial branch that would interpret the law. That's the way the system was set up. Now, that's not to guarantee that any law that's enacted is going to be a good law. We know that that's not the case. You know, that the government enacts drug laws, for example. We know as libertarians that those laws are bad. But there's this notion of the rule of law, and that is that people can adjust their conduct as long as they know what the law is in advance. They can plan their affairs. They can know that they don't need to answer to some policeman that's going to arrest them for something that they've done wrong that's not illegal. So this is what we know as the rule of law. It's not a guarantee of a free society, but it's a prerequisite for a free society. This is what Trump and, as you rightfully point out, Barack Obama and presidents before him have upended with these decree laws, or executive orders as they call them, is that they don't need to go through the legislature anymore. This is how dictators operate. I want action. I want action now. I don't want to have to go through the deliberative process. I'm going to now issue an order. And notice something important here. As far as I know, not one single federal bureaucrat has refused to go along with this. They all faithfully follow orders. Now, your point about hypocrisy is very well taken. I mean, let's go even deeper, Richard. I mean, you were talking about what the principles of a free society entail. They necessarily entail open borders, the free movements of people. Now, we're not talking about no borders. This is where Trump gets all confused and where immigration controllers get confused. We're not talking about no borders. We're talking about the right of people to freely cross borders in search of a job, to better their lives, whatever reason there is. For example, in Virginia and Maryland, we have a border. People are free to cross back and forth every day. Does the border disappear? Of course not. It just means that people are now subject to the jurisdiction in which they now happen to be traveling. If that's Virginia law. Same thing works internationally. So what we're talking about here is the right of people, and usually it's very poor people. And here's where the deeper hypocrisy goes in. I mean, ever since I became a libertarian, I've heard people on the left criticize us libertarians for opposing the welfare state. Oh, you hate the poor, the needy, and the disadvantaged. Their favorite little mantra, because we oppose mandatory government-enforced charity. But notice that immigrants are among the poorest, neediest, most disadvantaged people you'd ever find. And yet here are liberals, the people on the left, supporting immigration controls from the very beginning. I mean, they can complain about Donald Trump's dictatorship here, and rightfully so, but they themselves are responsible for the root of the problem, and that is the idea of immigration controls. And the same for people on the right. What's the favorite mantra of conservatives? Free enterprise, private property, and limited government. Yet you couldn't find a better example of violating people's right of economic liberty, of free markets, private property, than putting people in jail for daring to cross a border to go get a job from an American employer who wants to use his own private business, his own private resources to hire them. The hypocrisy goes on both sides, Richard. It's only we libertarians really that are consistent when it comes to moral and economic principles.
Yeah, I think I think we perhaps should bring out another point on our own political philosophic side of the fence, and that is that I notice that there has emerged a deep tension and conflict among some libertarians and others on the right, besides conservatives, and that is this very issue of blanket fear, condemnations, and wish to restrict the right of freedom of movement for certain people of certain religions. Amongst groups on the right who are not conservative and who are obviously not progressive in the left sense, there's this idea that Islam is inherently and inescapably anathema to a free society, that inescapably Islam is a religion of murder and hate and killing, and that 1 billion people are the enemy of everything that we stand for, and that therefore these 1 billion people who practice the Islamic faith must be excluded from the United States, must be sort of corralled in and either controlled or done away with, because they're the threats. Now, I hear these things and I read these things by even some people on our side of the political spectrum. That is, excluding conservatives who have many contradictions, but our side of the further fence. And I think that this is a dangerous precedent of thinking in collectives and in tribes, and failing to remember that we need to judge people as individuals. There was a time, as we've talked about in the past on dealing with immigration issues, that people would make generalizations about ethnic groups. Poles and Italians, we can't let them in, or Irish, because they're all Roman Catholics. Their allegiance is to the Pope, never to a constitutional secular society such as the United States. We can't let in Russian Jews. Religiously, they're the enemies of Christians, and besides that, they're all socialists. Russian Jews, they're all socialists. Well, there goes America. We can go all down the line with this. The fact is that it is true, in my understanding and my estimation, that Islam is about 300 or 400 years behind the West in having a reformation. That is a discovery and a realization that there must be some way to reconcile and harmonize one's deep religious faith, which is held with all sincerity and honesty, yet to have it function in a secular society in which the rights of conscience and belief and actions, as long as they're peaceful and honest, are respected in all others. Now, in a sense, again, from my readings, my understanding, much of what's going on in the Islamic world today is a variation of this battle of the Reformation. What does Islam represent? Not just between Shiites and Sunnis, but what type of society should Islam be part of? Should it be one that the faith dictates all human conduct, including compulsion by the state that is to protect the faith? Or is it one that there are balances between respect for divergence of views about religion or even non-religion, and the separation of church and state, and the separation of the faith from even economic affairs? Because traditionally Islam, like Christianity centuries ago, condemned interest, and you'd suffer big consequences if you were found guilty of taking interest on a loan. But the fact is, this means that right now, if my interpretation at least has a degree of correctness, that this is an evolving within Islam itself as to how it reconciles itself with modernity, then that means that there are a lot of Muslims who are not fanatics, who are not terrorists, who to one extent or another have tried to come to answers of how they make their faith fit into the global modern world. And many of them are like us. They have their faith, but they operate in societies that respect civil liberties, private properties, freedom of association. And to judge and condemn and therefore exclude every Muslim purely on the basis, as I hear some voices by some people on our side of the fence, because of their belief system from the United States, is inconsistent, insensitive, and a historical travesty against the most difficult and deep matters of conscience with individuals who happen to be of the Islamic faith, are in many cases working out for themselves. And many Muslims have nothing to do with the terrorism, the intolerance, the brutality, the cruelty that is highlighted on television news with, for example, Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, or the Taliban in Afghanistan. And to just make these blanket collective condemnations in which the innocent are thrown in with the guilty, to use that metaphor, is an abomination and a crime against our own sense of human decency and respect for the right of the individual, including his right of conscience.
Yeah, you raise an important issue that I think also has to be discussed in the context of U.S. foreign policy. I mean, if you go back before the 9/11 attacks, or let's say even before 1989, before the end of the Cold War, during the entire Cold War, I don't ever remember anyone expressing any concern about Muslims, about Islam, about the religion, about anything like that. The whole concern was about communism and the Soviet Union and Red China and Cuba and Berlin. In fact, when it was the Soviets doing the invading and occupying of Afghanistan, the U.S. actually partnered with extremist Muslims to help oust the Soviet Union from Afghanistan, or in the words of Kissinger, I think it was Brzezinski that said, let's give them their Vietnam. And so we were there arming these extremist Muslims, including people like Osama bin Laden, and people on the right were cheering about this. This is a wonderful thing that we're doing this, and we don't need to worry about Muslim terrorism down the line. Well, after the Cold War suddenly ends, the U.S. goes in and starts poking hornets' nests in the Middle East, and including a lot of families who were Muslim. We saw the Persian Gulf intervention. We saw the brutal sanctions over an 11-year period on Iraq that killed hundreds of thousands of children, many of whom were children of Muslim families. And so when the 9/11 attacks occurred, the U.S. immediately took the position that this was because they hate us for our freedom and values. Now, Bush at first referred to the Crusades and so forth, but immediately his advisors reined him in and said, no, limited to terrorists. Let's not make this into a religious war. And then later, Barack Obama tried to walk this fine line of saying, well, we're dealing with really extremist Muslims, not the regular Muslims. But Donald Trump has really, it seems to me, Richard, thrown those two playbooks out the window. And he's essentially said, look, the problem is Muslims itself. Now, he's denying that now, but by denying admission of all these Muslims from these predominantly Muslim countries, I think he's sending the message that, hey, we've got a problem with Islam. And this goes to the foreign policy problem we have, because as I see it, we now are being shown that we have 4 more years of Bush-Obama with respect to foreign policy. That is to say, he wants to continue. He's building up the military now, and he wants them to continue the fight against ISIS and against the Muslim radicals, and he wants to keep killing people in these predominantly Muslim countries, which means killing Muslims. If you're bombing a country, if you're assassinating a country of predominantly Muslims, you're going to be killing Muslims. And so what he's essentially saying is, we want to continue the 16 years of Bush-Obama. We want to continue killing people over there. We want to continue the fight against ISIS, but we want to protect Americans from the inevitable blowback that might come about because of this continuing killing campaign. I mean, we saw this when Ron Paul, in that first presidential debate back in 2007, where he said they came over here to kill us because we, meaning the U.S. government, was over there killing them first. And this is what Trump's not getting, or maybe he gets it and wants to ignore it. But this is what's going on here. The U.S. wants to continue this death machine in the Middle East instead of just bringing the troops home. If they brought the troops home, there'd be no more problems with terrorism. There'd be no more problems with Muslims getting angry that Muslims are getting killed by the U.S. death machine. But Trump has made it very clear that that's not going to happen, that the killing is going to continue, and therefore the threat of anti-American terrorism is going to continue, and therefore the walls, the immigration bans, the visa restrictions, and all the rest of the tyranny.
Yes, in fact, this point shows the lie for their own political purposes of those on the left who have said that Donald Trump and those around him represent an isolationist foreign policy, which of course has an extremely pejorative connotation in their mind. The idea that America will no longer be the enlightened and benefactor of global peace through being the planet's gendarme, but of course always for good causes that the progressives approve of. And yes, Donald Trump has criticized that whether the war in Iraq was really justifiable, all things considered, and that he's even said our task is not to try to make nations over our own image. Our concern is our own national interest, of course, as he defines it. But what happened just this past weekend? Under his watch now, an American military personnel was killed in Yemen since he was involved in actions against a terrorist group in Yemen. So in other words, your president, Mr. Trump, you haven't ceased and desist these military operations. You're still sending and putting American military personnel into harm's way, and in this case, causing the fatality of one of these young men in a continuing American aggressive policy of going to look for monsters to kill abroad. He's just continuing what we've had for too many years now.
Yeah, and the notion is that, he's going to keep us safe from the inevitable anger and hatred that these kind of interventions and this continuous death machine produces. They cannot keep us safe. I mean, this is the illusion of this immigration ban. Oh my gosh, he's gonna really keep us safe from people who want to retaliate. Really, what about Americans of Muslim faith that are sick and tired of this? How's he going to keep us safe from them? I mean, they're going to put guards and metal detectors at every mall in the United States, at every nightclub. I mean, it's ridiculous. All you need is one guy with an assault rifle or a bomb. It's amazing to me that nobody has set off bombs in malls or buildings here in the United States. But this is what I keep arguing to people, Richard, who have done it for decades now, that as long as the American people permit the U.S. national security state to continue killing people in the Middle East, you're going to have this constant threat of anti-American terrorism, along with all of the deprivations, the infringements on our freedom in the name of keeping us safe. I mean, immigration controls are a control or an attack on our freedom of association, our right to hire people who we want to hire. And notice that the more the death machine continues to kill people over there, the greater the need that the government feels to assault our own freedoms here at home. That's why the ultimate answer to this whole thing is bring the troops home. Whatever happens in the Middle East, it may be an Islamic regime. There are Islamic regimes. Iraq is an official Islamic regime. Afghanistan is an Islamic regime. If somebody doesn't believe me, go Google Constitution of these countries. They are U.S. installed regimes that are Islamic in nature. Whatever kind of regime exists over there, Islamic or non-Islamic, that's their business. It is not the business of the U.S. government to be installing regimes and killing people to put their people in public office. That's why, Richard, you hit the nail on the head. Is the role of the U.S. government, should it be to slay monsters overseas? And I would argue that that's the core of the problem. That as long as the government's over there trying to slay whatever monsters it sees, there's going to be this constant threat of anti-terrorism, anti-American terrorism, along with all the attacks on our own freedom here at home.
Absolutely. Because the fact is there is nothing that the United States government can do to try to keep us safe that does not require them. And I'm using safe in the way that those in Washington define safe in the context that you and I have been discussing today. There's nothing that they can do to keep us safe with their regulations, their controls, their surveillance techniques, their restrictions that does not reciprocally limit, narrow, confine, or prohibit a variety of peaceful and nonviolent actions by the American citizenry as well.
Yeah, and there's one other thing, ever since 9/11, I've had people on the right writing me saying, this is a war against Islam, this is a war against Islam. And it doesn't have anything to do with foreign policy. The idea is that I guess people don't mind getting their wedding parties bombed and their children killed and their parents assassinated. Apparently all that's irrelevant. It's just that the Muslims just hate America for its freedom and values. And I keep telling these guys, do not go out and start shooting Muslims because you're going to get indicted by a grand jury, state grand jury. You're going to get indicted for murder. And when you appear in that court, the judge is not going to allow you to defend on the basis that we're at war and that you were just killing the enemy. Well, I just noticed today that there was an attack on this mosque in Canada. I don't know who the malefactors are, but here's an example of this mindset that if you truly believe that this is a war against Muslims, then you're going to see more of the attacks on Muslims as part of this mindset that, oh, we have to kill the enemy. And I think people are going to learn that it's still the law in the United States. Hopefully it's still the law and will remain that way, that constitutes murder and that you're going to be indicted and prosecuted and punished for committing those murders. But that's where this mindset leads us, Richard.
Yeah, I would just say as a note to what you just said, the episode in Montreal yesterday, according to the news reports that I saw this morning, there were at least 2 assailants who broke into the mosque, and they seem to have been other Muslims because they shouted in Arabic, "God is great," as they were killing people. So it seems to have been a sectarian dispute. At least that's how the facts seem right now.
Well, maybe so, but the problem still remains that as long as people have this mindset that Islam's the problem, the potential exists for violence against Muslims in general. Anyway, Richard, we're out of time. Enjoyed the conversation. One thing about this presidency, seems to me like you and I are going to have a lot to talk about in the year ahead.
Absolutely. Oh, good. A good day and a good week to our viewers and listeners.
All right. And thank you for tuning in. We'll see you next week.